In this video, I'm going to show you how you can take a still image and bring it to life by adding in some digital movement. Thank you to Motion Elements for sponsoring this video. Now, as you can see, I've got my still image inside of Adobe Photoshop, and what I'm going to do here is separate the subject, which is this phone layer, and remove it from the background. So I'm going to have a foreground layer and a background layer. So when choosing your image, it's really important that you have a dominant subject that you can separate from the background. If you've got multiple people and there's multiple different layers, then it might get really complicated. So make sure you have a clear subject and a clear background. Now, as you can see inside of Photoshop, I've got one of the latest versions. So it's got this really cool feature where it says select subject or remove background. If I select subject, you can see it's selected the phone, but nothing else. I want to select this arm. So rather than doing the object selection tool, I'm going to go into the quick selection tool. I'm going to increase the size of the brush because it's quite a large subject in the foreground. There we go, just pull that down a bit. And now I'm just going to paint within this phone here, just so that we can select the phone. Here we go. And I'm just going to decrease the size of this brush just to get into those details. Now, it's really worth zooming into your frame because you'll spot more once you're zoomed in as opposed to zoomed out. So as you can see, I need to include this clip here. I need to include the trim of the phone. This needs to all be included. And if you want to get really precise, then feel free to just pull the size of that brush down and get really zoomed into this to make sure you've got a nice, perfect edge. You want to make sure everything is included. And if something is included that should not be included, then just hold the Option button on Mac. I believe that is Alt on Windows, but I'll double check. And then just keep working through this process and making sure you include all parts of the subject. Now, in my example, it is a phone, but this could be a person, or this could be something completely random. And then once you are done, we just want to make a copy of that. So the easiest way to do this is to just go Command-C, Command-V on Mac, or Control-C, Control-V on Windows. And if we turn off the background, you can see this is our subject now isolated in the foreground. And you can see this is why it's really important that we do a clean job here, because if I forgot a big section over here, then it would be really obvious here. So make sure you do a clean job of that. And then we're just going to turn the background layer back on. Now from here, I'm just going to hold the Command button, which is on Mac. On Windows, I believe it's Control. And I'm just going to select the copied layer, so layer 1. So it's brought that mask back. So I'm just selecting that thumbnail with that button held down, and that brings the mask back. And now from here, we can go to the top bar, select, go to Modify, and we'll pop Expand there. And we can expand this by maybe 20 pixels. Press OK. And now if we turn off the foreground layer, you can see this is what we have. So we've got this around here. And now from here, we can go into Edit, and we can either select Content Aware Fill, or we can do Generative Fill. So you might not see Gen Fill if you've got an older version of Photoshop. This is basically Photoshop's AI model. So it's using AI to build in and basically fill in whatever's within that mask. So we're removing the phone and we're using Gen Fill and AI to do that. But if you go to Content Aware Fill, it's a slightly older version, but it works all the same. I'm going to go for Gen Fill because this is the newer version. I'm just going to put remove, press generate, and you should see that this should now disappear for us. There we go. It's done a fantastic job. And if we double check all of these layers, you can select the one that's best for you. I'm going to select the first one because this one still looks like a camera in the background, so that's fine. And when I turn on the foreground layer, you can see we've now got the foreground and the background isolated from each other. Now I'm just going to turn off that top layer and the Gen Fill layer. And I'm just going to show you what Content Aware Fill would do. If we go into Edit, we can go to Content Aware Fill rather than the Gen Fill. And as you can see, it's doing the exact same process. So this is a sample area. We can press OK on this, and you can see it's got rid of it. It's not quite as clean as this version. I feel like the Gen Fill version looks a little cleaner. The Gen Fill's actually added in some cameras, and it looks like a more solid image, whereas the Content Aware Fill option is a little messy. But it doesn't matter too much because we're going to have the phone in the foreground anyway. We're just adding a little bit of movement, so we need to add in the background. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to turn off the foreground layer for now, and I'm just going to merge the background and the Gen Fill layer. So I'm just going to select both of these, right click, and select Convert to Smart Object. So that is now one object. So we've got foreground and we've got a background. But once you get to that point, you can go File, Save As, and we're going to save this as a Photoshop document. So Photoshop should be in the Format, Then you can place this wherever you want this to go and press save. Before we carry on with this video, let me please first just tell you about Motion Elements. Motion Elements are an amazing online platform for stock video, Adobe Premiere and After Effects templates, Notion templates, and so much more. And the great thing is I have teamed up with Motion Elements. They are the channel sponsor, and because of that, they are going to give you a really great discount on your first month of your subscription with them. So use the code in the description below to get yourself some big savings. So if you want to save time and create better videos, then consider checking out Motion Elements. Now, back to the video. Now we can jump into Premiere Pro and we can create a new sequence. I'm going to create a 1920 by 1080 sequence. We'll go to the Project tab, right click, select Import, and now you want to navigate to that PSD document, which is here, phone.psd. So I can just select Import, and that should load up this menu here. Now it's going to, by default, select Merge All Layers, which is taking the two individual layers and merging them into one. We don't want that. We want to import these as individual layers. That's why we separated them. So we're going to go to Individual Layers, press OK, and now that gives us a new folder or a new bin. Select the phone layer, and we can drag both of these into our new composition or a new sequence. Now, depending on the size of your image, you may need to scale up or scale down. Just make sure you match the scale from the top and the bottom layer, or the foreground and the background layer. So now with these stacked on top of each other, we've got our original image. And this now is where we can begin the animation process. So in order to do that, we want to go to the very beginning. And I'm going to create a brand new keyframe on the position on both of these. And then I'll go to the end and create a position keyframe on both at the same point. Great, now I'm going to go back to the very beginning and I'm going to move the phone layer over to the right. Then I'll go to the background layer and I'll move that to the left. Don't worry about this because we're going to just push in a little bit. Then we want to go to the end point, which is here. And we can just carry on that movement if we wanted to, or we could just leave that as it is. So by default, this is what we are looking at right now, which I think looks really good already. It's very subtle, but you could make this even more extreme. So if we go to that end keyframe, make sure you hover over the keyframe. You can extend that even more, so the background's going to slide even further, and now that's creating an even more dynamic result. Of course, we have got the problem of these black bars on the background. So there's two ways that we can address this. We can just scale in the background if we wanted to, like this. So scale in the background, and that gets rid of the problem. But if that messes up the frame for any reason whatsoever, then we can just highlight both of those layers, or right click, select Nest, and then you can just increase the scale on the nested sequence as opposed to just the background layer. So everything's being affected as a whole now. And as you can see, this is what we end up with. Now, as well as adjusting the position and the scale and the rotation and all of these in the Motion tab, we can also go into Effects and Presets and search for Basic 3D. And this means we can actually adjust some rotation in a 3D axis. So if we go to Swivel, we can add some swivel, or we could add some tilt if we wanted to make it even more interesting. So I'm going to drop Basic 3D on the background layer as well. Then I'm going to change the swivel on the background to a plus number, so +6 at the beginning. And then on the foreground layer, we're going to go to a negative number, so let's go -6. Of course, we're going to have to increase the scale a bit. Maybe push it down. Then you want to create a brand new keyframe on the swivel on both layers at the same point in time. We'll go to the end and we'll change them so 6 becomes -6, and on the other layer, -6 becomes 6. So let's play this back. As you can see, that's given us even more interesting. So we've got one layer doing this and another layer doing this, and on top of each other, it creates this really interesting effect. And of course, if you wanted to take this even further, then you could add some blurring effect. So if we go into blur, I typically like to go for a Gaussian blur or a Gaussian blur. Drop this onto the foreground layer, and you can rack focus from the foreground to the background. But in order to do that, you have to make sure that there is no blur in the background already. In this image, the background is blurred out, so it wouldn't work in this example. But if the background was in focus and the foreground was in focus, then we could create a fake rack focus effect where the background is in focus and then we shift it so that the foreground ends up in focus, and they essentially do this. So where one's blurry, the other's in focus, and they swap. And it creates that nice rack focus effect. It's just another way of bringing the photo to life. But if I start at 0 and then I increase the blurriness on the foreground to 27, you can see that gets blurry over time, and then the background would appear in focus. So it creates a much more interesting effect. And rather than just having a boring slideshow with static images, or maybe just a subtle push in like the Ken Burns effect, then we can create something a little bit more interesting with this effect. So separate the foreground from the background, animate them so they create a parallax effect or play with the focus, and that's going to create a really interesting effect. But that is now this effect now complete. So thank you ever so much for watching this video. I really do appreciate your support, and hopefully I will see you on the next video. See you there.